Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you're having a great day wherever you may be joining us from. Today's Healthicity webinar is a mid-year review of risk assessments, work plans, new regulations, and enforcement. I'm Kyle Brogdon. I'll be the facilitator today. Today's webinar will be about 45 minutes, and we will have a time of Q&A during or after, depending on how much time we have. Everyone on the line is muted, so post your questions or any comments to the questions dialogue interface here. And then after the presentation, we will email everyone with slides, links to the webinar recording to watch again or share, and your CEU certificate for this webinar. Today, our webinar presenter is Dr. CJ Wolf. CJ is a healthcare professional with more than 20 years of experience in revenue cycle management, practice management, compliance, coding, billing, and client services, and is a nationally recognized compliance thought leader. Take it away, CJ.
Thank you, Kyle. Thanks everyone for joining. We thought this was an important topic because it's always good to pause, take a look at what you planned for the year, and we're mid-year, right? I was reminded by a family member the other day how close we were to Christmas. And I thought, wait, it's midsummer. So let's look at our agenda today on how we can kind of think through a mid-year type of evaluation. Let's look at enforcement. What's happened in just the last 6 months? A lot of us plan our compliance program work in the prior year, and you might have like a work plan. You might have certain auditing plans or education plans, and you might get that approved by like your compliance committee or maybe your board. And that's all done maybe by the end of the year, depending on what your fiscal year is or what whatever you've determined it to be your annual cycle. But let's say you did that and that was all done in December. What's changed in the last 6 months? So we want to look at enforcement. Then I want to mention some recently announced focus areas. So enforcement, is telling us what's happened most recently with settlements, but those settlements are always a couple years back, right? The wrongdoing or the alleged wrongdoing was a couple years back, and the settlements are just coming out now. So on section 2, we're going to talk about recently announced focus areas. These are areas that we know moving forward, different enforcement agencies want to look at. And then we'll end up just discussing organizational risks and assessments and kind of why we should be always thinking about those activities, compliance activities, risks, assessments, etc. And we're going to have polling questions. So here's our first polling question today. We'd love for your participation. What is on your compliance radar now, today, that was not on your radar a year ago? And we're limited in the number of things we can put in the multiple choice. I suspect some of you are going to answer other. If you do answer other, we would love to hear what that other is. Some of those that I thought people might have on their radar now that was not, and you might want to say all of the above, but let's just pick one. The ending of the PHE, the public health emergency, and what are the compliance implications that came when that officially ended? Or is it nursing home emphasis by the OIG? Or maybe it's the DOJ enforcement of claims that are lacking medical necessity. There's been a lot of enforcement there. Or maybe it's just you've heard and you've seen a lot of audit work being done for services during the pandemic. So we'll let you answer those questions, or that question, I should say. And we do welcome if you pick other, we'd love to hear what's that thing on the radar now that just was not there a year ago?
The first other that we have is AI.
Oh, such a good one. Artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Got another other. That sounds great. Patient right of access audits and education for staff.
Yeah, right of access on the HIPAA side. Good one.
All right, let's have a look at the overall results.
Yeah, so look at that, 43%. Still, it's that PHE ending and those compliance implications. Yeah, right. I think a lot of us kind of had it in the back of our minds, like, yeah, eventually this thing's going to end. But a year ago, we didn't really know the exact date, and so that's probably top of mind for a lot of people. And then the next two are tied at 20%. DOJ enforcement for claims lacking medical necessity, and audits for services during the pandemic. Yeah, and then 9% are looking at nursing home and 9% other. And some of you have shared those others, so we really appreciate that information.
Yeah, very good.
Excellent.
A couple of others real quick. Data related items, breaches, phishing, DOJ guidance in non-company controlled communication systems, globalization, MSOPC compliance, and right of access. Those are a few others.
Yeah, those are awesome. And one of those that was mentioned, the DOJ compliance kind of guidance, we're going to talk about that because that was an update in March. Great, thank you for sharing that. And be ready at the trigger for our other polling questions as we go through the sections. So let's talk about some recent enforcements that have all happened since January. Of course, there's so many, we can't go over all of them. These were some that kind of caught my attention. Nursing homes. So nursing facilities. I know not everyone is in nursing facilities, but it's good to know, even if you aren't a nursing facility yourself, if your physicians go to nursing facilities to provide services. This one was interesting because it involved both the nursing facility and physicians or clinicians. This nursing facility settled for $3.8 million. It was in California, and the allegations were of kickbacks to referring physicians. And just some examples of some of the alleged kickbacks were just extravagant gifts, dinners, golf trips, massages, limo rides, e-reader tablets, gift cards, and the list can go on and on, right? There's so many different ways to give something of value that could potentially be used to induce referrals. And so that's a no-no, right, under the Anti-Kickback Statute. And the other thing here is monthly stipends for purported medical director services. None of this is really that new. Like if you've been in compliance for a long time, I've been doing this for over 4 years or so now. These types of things have happened during all those years. So they just continue to happen. But what's interesting on the last one there, the monthly stipends, remember, you might have, so the extravagant gifts and dinners, those might be a little more obvious of things not to do, but a lot of people are like, what's wrong with being a medical director? Absolutely nothing. However, in a medical director contract or agreement that's written, it'll spell out what your duties are. You can't just be named a medical director and then not do the duties. That's where it would be perceived or alleged, like in this case, where you're just getting paid for this title and you're not really doing anything. So if you're being paid, it has to be fair market value. It has to be explicit services that you're performing, and there should be some sort of record of what those services are that you're doing, right? Like maybe each month, just getting paid, $2,500 a month, $5,000 a month for being the medical director, and then you don't actually do anything, or you can't demonstrate that you've done anything, could be an allegation ready for a kickback allegation. Okay, on the next slide, I think we stick with nursing facilities in the same one. I just wanted to mention that this particular nursing facility also entered a 5-year corporate integrity agreement. And as we've mentioned in many of our webinars, these corporate integrity agreements will require certain compliance program activities. And one of the activities required for this particular CIA is hiring at the expense of the nursing facility, an independent review organization to review physician relationships. Now, that's not, friends, are you friends or this and that? What they mean is all the financial relationships. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and the whistleblower in this case was a former accounting employee. It's really important if you're in compliance to know all the ins and outs of the funds, right? So that you can question them. Okay, so we have these 6 doctors acting as medical directors. Can I see their agreements, and can I see the documentation that they're actually doing what's in that agreement? Or, if you have, so make friends with your accounting folks and people in accounts payable and who are writing the checks and those sorts of things. If there's checks going out for a trip, sometimes those are legitimate, but you find out, oh, you're sending 8 doctors to Hawaii for this conference. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, Are they in a legitimate conference, or is it, half hour of teaching and then 9 hours of golf? That might not pass the sniff test, and what's the purpose? So that's why I thought this one was important to identify that the whistleblower in this case was the accounting employee who probably was in the know on what was going in and out from a financial standpoint. So this next one is urgent care. It's an urgent care chain, and they settled for $1.6 million. So I think a lot of us in our communities are familiar with urgent care chains, right? You can't get in to see your doctor, so you might go to an urgent care. It's not the emergency room, but they're essentially outpatient clinics, right, that take people without scheduled appointments. And I think many of us have used those. In this particular case, it was alleged that during COVID, this urgent care center was automatically upcoding their E&M codes. For those of you who don't know, E&M codes are evaluation management codes. Those are the codes, kind of the bread and butter of doctor services, right? If you're a doctor and you're not doing procedures like a surgery or a scope or an injection or something like that, the brain sweat of doing your history, your physical exam, and the medical decision making are coded with these E&M codes. So what was alleged here was that, and these were associated with patients who had suspected exposure to COVID during the pandemic. And in this particular case, the whistleblowers, there was a few, but two that caught my attention, or three here, nurse practitioner and a physician and a billing specialist. They filed, I believe the nurse practitioner and the physician filed a claim together, a False Claims Act claim, and then the billing specialist filed one separate. It's also interesting to note that this was utilizing the new 2021 E&M guidelines. And the issue at hand was, it was alleged that if a patient was positive for COVID via a rapid test, but there were no other risk factors, they were automatically coded as a level 4. So remember, in evaluation and management coding, you have multiple levels. The higher the level, the greater the reimbursement. 5 is the highest for some outpatient codes. And you can see at the bottom, the code sets that were alleged were the new patient codes, the 99202 through 99205, and the established patient codes of 99212 through 99215. So in addition to automatically just coding these positive tests as 4s, now, and that's not to say that some of those aren't legitimate level 4s. You can be positive for COVID, and that can be a very serious thing. But you can also be positive for COVID and have no symptoms, right? And have no problems. So just because you're positive for COVID and you have no other risk factors, that does not automatically mean everyone is a 4. And that's what was alleged in this case. Also, there was drive-through testing. Oh, sorry, if we can just go back one slide. The drive-through testing was a separate little thing saying, okay, and a lot of us probably did this when we were getting tested for COVID, we would drive through, not get out of our cars, we would be tested. Somebody may ask us certain questions, and then we would finish and go through. What was being billed, it was alleged that those were being billed, and the doctors were not out there in the drive-through. It was medical assistants and those types of people. And those can usually be billed as a 99211. But what was being billed was 99212 through 215 because history was taken, physical exam, at least looking at them, was being done, and some brief medical decision making, but it was not done by the doctor. So you can't bill in the doctor's name when they're not the ones doing that. And these were not nurse practitioners, et cetera, doing incident 2. Okay, thanks. Now let's go to some more on this. I thought this quote was interesting. Again, these are allegations, so this does not go to court. There's not a trial. They settled ahead of time. So just keep in mind that we're not saying somebody's guilty. But these were the allegations. Most of the patients whom defendants test have mild or no symptoms and test negative for the virus. For such patients, defendants' providers spend just a few minutes per visit, primarily to announce the test result. The vast majority of patients are then sent home with a 1-page CDC guideline sheet for COVID testing without follow-up care. Providers do not perform any significant medical assessment or decision-making for these patients. They do not examine prior records, consult other providers or independent historians, or perform additional tests or procedures. That's what they alleged. Okay, and I think we could all see how, if that was true, that would be a problem. On the next slide, we continue with a little bit more of what the allegations were. Because they, the non-physician clinical staff, are doing all the same components of an office visit at the drive-through testing site, obtaining vitals, history, visual exam if no symptoms, physical exam if they're symptomatic, ordering and resulting of test results, no different than going physically into the clinic. This is how we are to report per payer guidelines. This was a quote. Allegedly, this came from an email from their director of billing and reimbursement services. This was in the court documents as an alleged email that they sent. And we can see how this would be problematic. This is that drive-through testing. If this is true, and this is what they were doing, just because they're getting all those services and they're being done by non-physician clinical staff, like a medical assistant or maybe an RN, there's not going to be an opportunity to bill those higher level E&M codes as if, what they say at the bottom here, no different than going physically into the clinic. Well, it is different from a billing standpoint. So that was some of the allegations in this one. Another settlement is with a cardiologist. This cardiologist recently settled for $5 million. And it was alleged that the cardiologist was performing medically unnecessary atherectomy procedures. So we all know cardiologists work on the heart, but they also, when there's atherosclerosis in the heart vessels, there can also be atherosclerosis in the head and neck vessels, in the vessels of the leg, for example. And in this case, the cardiologist was working on alleged plaques or kind of plaque buildup in the leg arteries. But the allegations were that the cardiologist was systematically overstating the percentage of stenosis. Stenosis is the amount of narrowing, right? And if it's, if the narrowing is like 50% or more, you usually have medical necessity to do certain types of procedures. Well, what if the narrowing was only 1% or 2% or 0%, but the doctor stated that it was 50 or 60 or 70%? Well, that's not truthful documentation, but it was alleged that that's what this cardiologist was doing, overstating the amount of stenosis so that the doctor could then go in and do these procedures. So putting patients at risk for procedures that they didn't really need to have was part of the allegation. And the services were not supported by the retained medical records for the procedures provided and billed. So in this case, the government intervened. They did what's called a CID, a civil investigative demand, which is kind of like a subpoena. They ask for records. So they get these allegations, they ask for records, and allegedly, when they looked at some of the imaging, there was no narrowing, even though the doctor stated in the medical record that there was narrowing. Now, this is important for coders to recognize, because coders are just going off of what's in the medical record. That's what they're supposed to do. They read what's in the medical record and they pick a code. So we're not faulting the coders, but what was in the medical record was false. And the only way to know that was to look at the x-rays. And so this is a medical necessity type of issue, not a coding issue per se. So on the next slide, I think there's a little bit moving on to a medical center now. This medical center settled for almost $30 million, allegedly for, again, kickbacks, providing kickbacks to physicians. But look at how it was allegedly provided. It was alleged that the medical center provided these physicians with mid-level practitioners, so nurse practitioners and physician assistants that were employed by the medical center. But it was alleged the medical center was providing those professionals to the doctors at no cost or below fair market value. So if you're in private practice as a physician, you have to hire that mid-level practitioner. They don't just come free, right? And so instead of the practice incurring that expense, the medical center said, we'll hire them, we'll let you use them. And that's a kickback, right? It's not cash in an envelope in a dark alley at midnight, right? It's something in kind that the practice normally would have to pay for themselves, but the medical center was doing it. So that was the allegation. And how did they pick the physicians? It was alleged that the physicians were selected because of the large number of referrals to that hospital. Okay, so remember, the Anti-Kickback Statute says you can't give anything of value or offer anything of value for past, present, or future referrals. And the whistleblower in this case was a physician who was a physician at a medical school that had been affiliated with this medical center. And as you know, whistleblowers receive a portion of the funds, a percentage of the recovered funds. In this case, received $5.2 million, which is a portion of that almost $30 million. Okay, let's look at the next one here. This is a lab that settled for $300,000. And again, this goes back to COVID. The allegations were that in addition to performing COVID tests, the lab was, they were automatically, there were orders and then performance of medically unnecessary respiratory pathogen panels. So of course you do the COVID test, but there are other pathogens or other germs that can cause pneumonia and those sorts of things. And it was alleged that they were doing that kind of automatically. They were testing residents who lived in senior living communities, and there were discrepancies about the physician order. Of course, there are going to be times when a person with COVID, you have to test for these other pathogens, but it's not automatic. Those decisions have to be individually determined based off of individual medical necessity for each patient, not an automatic type of thing. Now, to the credit of the lab brought this information to the government. So the lab themselves found it during their own auditing, right? They did their own investigation. They did an internal investigation, and they disclosed the facts to the government. And so the government gave them a very significant discount, if you will, in the settlement amount. Now, that might not sound very great, but look at all those other cases we just went through. We're talking millions of dollars, right? In this case, they settled for $300,000. Now, of course, the numbers will depend on the specifics of the case, but the point being is the lab received credit for their compliance program finding this issue and self-disclosing. And so, you know, we don't know all the details, but it was a significant reduction in the amount that the lab had to pay once they identified that non-compliance. So that's a good moral, I think, of the story, is compliance programs are supposed to prevent, detect, and correct non-compliance. And so if you can't prevent it, but you did find it, you self-disclose, and you usually get some sort of credit for that. Okay, I think that may have been our last one for section 1. Now, section 2, we want to focus on recently announced focus areas. So I